Hello, everybody. Good morning. So, on behalf of the Red Belt team, I would like to warmly welcome Motri, who is going to introduce you to the Semi-Plenary. She's from the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, and IS is part of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. And they are one of our conference co-hosts. So the Institute's vision is a world transformed through good governance and leadership excellence based on values like public-spirited, resolute, imaginative, diverse, and ethical. So I'd like to thank the ES team for putting together this semi-plenary and also for contributing to build this conference. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. So hello, good afternoon everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this semi-plenary, where we will be discussing about the EUDR and its implications on trade relations and supply chains. So this semi-plenary is being organized by the Institute for Environment and Sustainability, housed at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. So ICE, our director, loves to say that we are the eyes on the environment and sustainable development of the world. So ICE is a very new research think tank under the Lee Kuan Yew School. We were formed just last year, but don't underestimate us, because we are an old man's mind with the leadership of a very enthusiastic director, Professor Benjamin Kishore, in a young person's body. So we have been there. ICE comes with the legacy of the Institute of Water Policy that had been working with government agencies at Singapore since 2005. And from researching on water policy area, our school decided to kind of like expand our research sector into different thematic areas like climate and energy, biodiversity, sustainable livelihoods, and of course, finally, water. So today we are going to discuss about the European Union's latest drive to ensure deforestation-free supply chains and kind of ensure a green consumption pattern within the entire continent. So for this, we have organized this panel, and the panel, give me a moment. So I would like to welcome our panel chair, moderator, Professor Benjamin Kishore, the director of Institute for Environment and Sustainability, and our very honorable speakers, who are Professor George Winkle from Wageningen University. He will explore the impacts of, he will introduce the session discussing on what EUDR is and on different for deforestation policies. Yeah, here I get it. We'll give an introduction into the field of global forest governance, zooming in on deforestation policies. He would be looking into international forest policy and major frontiers that have developed globally in the field and connecting them to broader trends and policy arrangements, followed by Professor Metodi Sotirov from the University of Freiburg. He will be talking widely about his ongoing research on the EU deforestation policies, including the policy-making process, setting of coalitions between countries, interest groups, and responses from target countries. Finally, introduce the main policy instrument, which is the EUDR, the EU's deforestation-free regulation. And followed up by Professor Constance McDermott, our Professor Connie from the University of Oxford. She will be talking about the outside of EU perspective, enlightening on the possible repercussions of EUDR in timber supplying countries such as Ghana, and she will be presenting her first findings from her research in Ghana. So over to you, Ben. Here you go.
Thank you, Matri. Wonderful to be here. And yes, as Matri said, our institute is new, but we have a wonderful, energetic staff. Matri is the highlight. And we should mention we are hiring at multiple levels. So this is your little pitch. And there are actually job descriptions up there in the corner if anybody wants to talk more about that. That's the pitch for eyes. Couple of things about eyes. We noted that think tanks looking at sustainability policy and governance in universities are quite common in North America and Europe, but they're very scant in Southeast Asia. And so our purpose is to build that kind of community in that part of the world. And as part of those efforts, we were recently recognized as ESG's latest research center. Yay, so we're very happy with that. You can clap. Woo, yeah. And excited to bring more of a southern set of voices to these questions. And I appreciate the irony that I'm saying that. Okay, I love ironies as director there, but that kind of focus is really where we're targeting our efforts. One quick thing too, I think it's quite telling that we have two semi-plenaries right now on water and forests in the Eleanor Ostrom building. She spent her career on water and forests. So Ostrom is very much present, not just in the building itself, but in our very ideas that we're talking about. And with that, we've got an amazing group of three leading forest policy and governance scholars, as you know, all of which I go back in time with many, many years, which is why my hair is now gray, but I'm still young in spirit, Matri. But also, we've been researching as a group and as a part of a broader network all kinds of efforts on the part of the North, from eco-labeling systems to C&I processes to legality verification, and now this latest one, the EU no deforestation regulation, efforts to address what's going on in the South. But oftentimes, what happens is you run the experiment, you do what you think is a good job, and you end up underachieving. And you realize, oh, I didn't realize that the South worked that way. You didn't know enough about the actual South on the ground. And you repeat what we call the policy creation euphoria, implementation depression cycle of global climate and environmental and forest policy governance. So we want to, with this semi-plenary, reverse those trends by getting ahead of an emerging issue and see if we can't not just study the gall darn thing, but maybe add suggestions for how it can be modified or changed based on what our speakers have to say today and as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I will hand it over to Georg first, correct? So welcome, Georg, to begin this conversation.
Thanks, Ben.
Maybe while Georg is coming in, setting up the movie is coming in, so people on the outside should squeeze in a little bit so people that come in late don't cause a lot of commotion. I would really appreciate it, especially on that side.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben and Moitre, for the invitation and a very nice introduction. Before I start, I wanted to point out that we're also hiring, so be alerted for postdoc positions and other positions coming up in our Forest Nature Conservation Policy Group at Wageningen. To give it a start, governing the world's forest trend, frontiers and challenges ahead. When Connie, McTody, Ben, and Moitre were chatting about what to do in this session, we established this idea that I would give it a start with a very general presentation on forest policy, forest governance, conflict lines, or frontiers, as I will label them. While then after that presentation, I will hardly mention any EU deforestation policy. After that presentation, we dive deep into the issue with the two subsequent presentations, just to warn you already. This is a presentation based on emerging collaborative work. I want to name some of the collaborators in a really emerging paper. I was actually hoping it would be much more emerged when we are meeting now here. We are still in a more initial stage. And all mistakes in this presentation are, of course, mine. Well, setting the scene, forest landscapes are in ongoing transition globally. Key patterns are land use change. That's also what the EU deforestation regulation is about. We lost forest cover went down from 45% to 30%, but it's a long process over centuries. Now we focus a lot on the tropics in our debate, but previously deforestation was a big issue in North America, in Asia, and even before that in the Mediterranean context. There's a commodification of the remaining forest area, so there are ideas how to produce more biomass, plantation forestry, intensive forestry, different forestry regimes. And there are, of course, environmental concerns relating to forests, specifically their importance for climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation. A much loved and much hated overview on the trajectory of forests on the globe, much hated, specifically from the social science side, so probably many people that know it in the room don't like it very much, is the forest transition idea, where the idea is basically to have both the theory of change of the forest system from whatever it is exactly a kind of primary forest to logging more to an agriculturally used area, and then the forest come back in a later trajectory. And what's interesting there is that this is correlated in the transition thinking to development, to economic prosperity partly, where first economic development is correlated with deforestation, using forest resources and expansion of agriculture, and later when societies become more rich or are able to export their environmental footprint, there's a forest come back by abandoned agricultural land. And on the right side, I think it's also from your side, the right side, I hope, you can see that you can also apply this spatially across context, across countries, and see countries where this transition is probably in an earlier stage, while in others there's already a substantial forest come back. However, the forest that is coming back is very often not the forest that was lost before. Today there's more trends that are accompanying or driving these forest transition. For instance, climate change, which is increasing uncertainty massively in the forest policy debate. Will we have forests at one point in the future? What's about large-scale disturbances? It causes shocks like forest fires or is related to them. There are socioeconomic changes, dramatic demographic changes around the globe, changing economic power that also correlates with changing policy settings. And I think a lot of the debate we will hear later on the EU deforestation policy is also related to changing economic power and responses to that on the globe. And then the big idea of a green transition or transformation, where forests play a big role, on one hand as an ecosystem to be conserved, on the other side as an ecosystem to be used, as many would argue, for biomass production. There's technological change. Specifically interesting, there was a debate in Nature some years ago where there was a contestation of national forest inventories in Europe that since centuries tried to monitor the state of forests by new technology with remote sensing, where probably there were diverging findings on forest intensity of use, specifically in Northern Europe. Super interesting debate in that journal. It shows that with advancing information technology, there's perhaps more transparency. But of course, as we all know, knowledge is also correlated to power. There's a shifting in power balances related to shifting possibilities to gather forest-related information. Changing geopolitics, I wasn't sure about that term in this room here, multipolar world, perhaps a certain shift away from some patterns of globalization towards the establishment of socio-economic blocks. We will probably debate this later today with consequences for policy making. In the remainder of the talk, what I would like to do is to identify, based on collaborative work in a special issue we published about 2 years ago, 5 major global forest frontiers that I would argue are decisive for global forest governance today. And with frontiers, I understand fault lines or zones of transition where forest transitions are happening connected to socioeconomic, but also environmental and cultural factors. And I would like to elaborate on some key governance challenges, as I would like to label them, connected to these 5 global frontiers. Let's begin with the land use change frontier, which is arguably the most prominent now in this room, with talking about EU deforestation policy. The substance is deforestation and forest restoration. Deforestation mostly linked to agricultural expansion. About 80% of the forests that we are losing globally we are losing because of the expansion of agricultural production, driven by economic growth, but also by population growth and changing consumption patterns. Restoration, vice versa, often related to land abandonment, for instance, in parts of Europe, but also in parts of Africa, for instance, but also to forest investments. Then it's not a naturally regrown forest, but very often a forest plantation and carbon markets is the other side of the land use change frontier. Consequences, deforestation, well, there are positive consequences, if you want to label it like such. More food production. There are obviously negative environmental consequences, why this is hotly debated, related to biodiversity loss, especially tropical rainforests being the harbor of most of the terrestrial biodiversity on the planet, and climate change mitigation aspects. Restoration, very variable consequences, depending on what it exactly means. Restoration is one of the big buzzwords, I would say, in the forestry and agricultural community, and it can mean many things, from industrial plantations that arguably have a different impact compared to a natural forest regrowth, which is happening, as I said, in other regions of the world. Regional variations. I think many people that think about forests from an environmental perspective are concerned or have this impression that deforestation is a global phenomenon, and it is in a sense an historic phenomenon. But today we are mostly talking about deforestation in the context of tropical forests, because the other parts of the world have been deforested in the past, while restoration is more or less a global movement. Policy responses, I want to be very brief here because the remaining two presentations were very much focused on this. We had private sector commitments, zero deforestation commitments. We have new governmental policies in the EU and the UK. We had before climate market-based instruments. Actually, I would say since decades, there's a lot of focus on international global forest governance on this topic of deforestation. Similarly, in a sense, in restoration policies where you have more a trend towards voluntary commitment, but also private funding and markets, for instance, related to carbon. Well, what's the big challenge here in this? It's to align, I would say, southern and northern perspectives on deforestation and restoration to mitigate the transition process. This is very abstractly spoken, and I think it will become much more concrete in the subsequent presentation, specifically in the Ghana perspective by Connie. Let's move on. Conservation use frontier. I thought the easiest way to illustrate what this is about is with these two pictures of the lumberjack and the conservationist. This is the substance of that frontier is basically conservation versus forest use. I used again two buzzwords, if you like. Biodiversity on the one hand, bioeconomy on the other hand. It is related to changing values in societies, but also within the academic system. The rise of new disciplines like, well, not so new anymore these days, like conservation, biology on the one hand, and the intensification of forestry and forest management, industrial forestry on the other hand. Consequences are conflicts between biomass demand and biodiversity conservation, and it's a global pattern. This is a conflict in basically all countries I have been working with in one or the other way, but it's the most prominent pattern in the, I would say, if you want to divide the world still in north and south, which will be an interesting point for our discussion, in the more developed world, especially in the big industrial forestry countries such as Canada, Scandinavian countries. And policy responses are all policy instruments related to land sharing and land sparing and all the nuances. Let's move on. No, we don't move on. We first identify a key challenge based on that, which is to understand the potential, the true potential of land sharing versus land sparing. That's an ongoing discussion since decades. And also to think about effective and inclusive governance approaches, especially in the field of land sharing, where there's a lot of debate about if this is possible or desirable. The rights and justice frontier is probably the most governance-related frontiers of the five I'm going to present now. It's relating to changing and contested forest use rights, and it comes down, I would say, in two different variants. One is clashing legal systems, often customary informal rights of local and indigenous people on the one hand versus more formalized rights, central state rights or business-related rights on one hand. And secondly, I would say more in the north, specifically also in Europe, discussions about privatization and forest sector reforms that in the end are targeting this question of how to best manage public forest lands. Again, it's not very easy to talk about the consequence of these big topics here in probably half a minute. There are losers and winners of all types of intervention, be it forestry reforms. There's the concerns about displacement of local people, especially in the tropical world, where a lot of the forest use rights are informal and customary. And when they are then confronted, I'm also confronting my microphone here, I have the feeling, when they are then confronted with big policies that they're trying to regulate deforestation with a very formal and law-based approach, potentially, and changing management practices. I mentioned already the regional variations. The first topic of informal versus formal is specifically a prominent pattern in many tropical countries, but it's also globally relevant. Conflicts between, for instance, business investments and the state and local communities. We had just a very interesting presentation 10 days ago about the situation in Ireland, where you have big investments in plantation forestry clashing with local communities, at least informal rights and understandings of access right to their land. And policy responses are, for the first topic, legality policies, but also devolution, community forestry, a big topic in our field. How can we encourage communities to develop a sense of ownership and co-management of their forests? And for the second topic, forest sector reforms. What's the challenge ahead? It is basically how can we involve different forest-related groups or even society at large in the seek for more just governance arrangements, and also very much problematizing on one hand the role of the state, who could play the role of a suppressor here on one hand, but also could be an enabler depending on how the state acts to encourage diversification and participation in forest governance. The urbanization frontier is a fourth frontier I would like to introduce. The main topic is urbanization, understood as one hand as a biophysical process of big cities forming with their massive demand for resources and biomass, at the other hand a sociological process of urbanization, of creation of urban societal demands towards forests and the landscape. It's driven by population growth, a transition away from the primary sector. Less and less people in most countries of the world are directly related to land use, but all remain indirectly related to the use of biomass and food. It's a global phenomenon, but of course with big, substantial regional variances. And urban forest governance, urban planning, aligning urban demands with the rural hinterlands are policy responses to that frontier. What's the challenge here? It is to understand the impacts of cities, of growing megacities, on mostly rural forests, but also to develop just governance arrangements responding to rural-urban differences in lifestyles and values and relating to those impacts. One more, climate change. Obviously, it needs to be here. The climate change frontier here, a picture from the German Harz Mountain in a national park, where you have this huge dead spruce forest that, of course, is from a conservation perspective seen as a super interesting large-scale disturbance, from a more local population or forest use perspective seen as a big disaster of a non-intervention conservation strategy. Climate change affects the forest policy and governance debate directly through biophysical impacts like large-scale disturbances, think about large wildfires, but also indirectly through a change in how people believe land needs to be managed and through policies and policy impacts. Drivers are both climate change and responses of forest policymakers, but also people managing forests and agricultural lands. There's a changing ecology, including new disturbance patterns, which may shift the topic of forest land use suddenly to a high politics topic. If you have a major forest dieback or a major forest fire, suddenly the top of the government needs to deal with it. So it escapes from the sectoral dynamics that usually are prominent in that field. And of course, you have also shifting forest productivity patterns. We're having a PhD on sustainable finance and forest who is interviewing all these investors. And there's a clear shift towards the north, towards investing in northern forests, away from the central temperate forests that are seen as much more risky business under circumstances of climate change. It's a global phenomenon, and obviously forests play a role in two variants here. One in climate mitigation. That's one of the big arguments why we are fighting against deforestation. On the other hand, adaptation. So how can we adapt forests? Do we need to adapt? Can they adapt themselves to a dramatically changing climate? Red is the big topic here, and climate finance. Identifying a challenge ahead for that frontier is to understand the impact of climate change on forest ecosystems, obviously something we won't do in this room mostly, but also on people's beliefs, on ideologies in the sector and behind, to identify also winners and losers of climate change and climate change policies. There's a lot of lobbying in that field for using climate change also as a topic, for instance, to maximize income from subsidies and also to mitigate impacts. Closing words. Thanks for your flexibility in terms of time management, I'm just realizing. Summary, I think what I wanted to do in my talk is to go beyond current policy agendas, which we will now focus on a lot with the EU deforestation policy, to a bit look in the long-term dynamics, forest transitions, and forest governance areas, some of them being there since I started my career in this field, I think even most of them. I've argued that there's the possibility to identify 5 distinct forest frontiers that characterize this transition process: land use change, conservation, forest use, rights and justice, urbanization, and climate change. Obviously, as smart people, you will all realize that they are very much interconnected, but still there are main topics and also major research themes behind. The 5 frontiers are driven by an interplay of policies, people, and economics, and also science. Different scientific communities play a big role in different frontiers, and they relate, of course, from a more constructionist worldview to different problematizations. What's actually seen as the main problem here? Is it deforestation, or is it inclusion of local people and livelihoods in solution strategies? And for governance chorus, there's, I think, a need to engage with society, to diversify the perspectives, but also with the economics and the natural sciences to understand, that's a tricky word in this context, real-world changes and impacts of the frontiers that I have presented. Thank you very much. Look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Georg. Is that on? It'll turn on automatically. Wow. Thank you, Georg, very much for that. And just a couple of thoughts. I'm going to follow up and ask you a question, not now, because I want to get Connie to come on next, but just for you to think about, which is this, on the one hand, you're presenting a very complex review of how forests actually work in practice. It's not an easy way to characterize forests as doing one thing. Then you, of course, talked about the debate between livelihoods and conservation. So I'm going to come back to you when we come back to our roundtable to get your thoughts then on how we think about the measuring the effectiveness of the last 30 years of efforts, and how do we think about the no deforestation regulation in that context, if it does one thing well and perhaps not another thing well. And Georg mentioned financing, and Connie will talk about another's REDD+, which was in 2007 the big answer to addressing all these problems, which didn't actually work out the way we thought it would. And now we have, 2 years ago, Glasgow's financial promises, but now Georg's telling us actually we're looking to go towards the north now as a place to invest because of all the backlash on that. Again, this policy creation euphoria, implementation depression cycle continues. So I'm going to ask you about that kind of question, Georg, when we follow up. But now I want to welcome Connie. Sorry? Sorry? Sorry, Metodi. It's Metodi next, pardon me. I want to welcome Metodi next, not Connie, to follow up. And Metodi, who's worked on, as you'll see, both the intervention and the responses on these questions. So welcome, Metodi. Yeah, see, preview questions.
Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you, Ben, for this kind of introduction. It's really my honor and pleasure to be here. So I'm going to give you a summary of both the politics of the adoption and design of the EU deforestation regulation, and to the extent possible, the time allows, would like to give you some insights on the very specific positions that the different involved parties have formulated. This work is ongoing. It's based on a collaboration with my PhD student, Lila Burning. So I'm happy really to share some published and unpublished papers that have informed this talk. Right. So probably to follow up on what Ben already said about the euphoria and also frustration stage of that. So this slide is showing actually the euphoria part of the exploitation. So and very much drawing on an earlier work done by Professor Kishore, by Yuban and colleagues. In our work, we are seeing that the adoption of the EU deforestation regulation represents nothing but ratcheting up of regulatory standards. Okay, so we call that type 3 because basically it's a hard law that contains not only legality mandatory standards, but also sustainability mandatory standards, which is really new. For many decades, we have had either voluntary, private, non-state market governance, to coin back key concept that Ben Kishore has advanced over the years, advancing sustainability, but still very voluntary in nature. And in between, for now a decade, we have had legality verification instruments like the EU timber regulation, EU FLECT, voluntary partnership agreements, and many so on, where these instruments have put emphasis only on legality, but not on sustainability. And it remains, of course, to be seen if this euphoric stage will materialize in as euphoric implementation or rather frustration. So there are some hints in my slides on that, so I hope this will be understandable. This slide is showing a summary of some of our key results, mapping actually the different policy outputs that were created, discussed, negotiated between the different key EU institutions, the EU Commission, the EU Parliament, and the Council of the European Ministers. You can imagine, time is short now, that the very adoption of the EU deforestation regulation has been subject to very tough political discussions. In the end, still, one could say that the final output is a quite of a euphoric compromise, I would to stay with the same dilemma, because regardless of the different debates, there has been a common political support for the EU deforestation regulations, whereas the Commission has managed really to influence a lot the final legal text. It managed really to adopt high regulatory standards, high implementation procedures, also incorporated the Parliament's recommendations for mandatory due diligence, for example. For example, the EU Parliament managed also to add the human rights elements in due diligence procedures, also to expand the rules on penalties, also strengthening of the access to justice and many other aspects. Whereas the Council, this is representing the member states of the European Union, managed to somehow water down a bit the sustainability standards, and also managed also to allow for some exemptions for so-called small and medium-sized enterprises. I'm entering now something like key conclusions and findings section, and there are a lot more slides that I attached and took with me that we can really discuss afterwards. So in our studies, it became clear that regardless of very, very political, tough discussions, still among the three EU institutions, the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council, there has been quite an agreement, basic agreement, and a very strong political momentum to adopt the EU deforestation regulation. Again, very euphoric process. Strategic for this adoption has been the availability and the use of strategic resources like public opinion, public support, assessment studies, and of course, the decision-making authority of those different EU institutions. Right. When we compare the EU deforestation regulation with the existing or the previous instruments like the EU timber regulation, one would really observe the ratcheting of standards. Already talked about that the EUDR now includes not only legality standard, but also sustainability standard. It includes also the request to pay attention also to human rights, indigenous people rights, and grants a lot of possibility to justice and access to information, etc. And of course, it has also made specific provisions about levels of penalties, frequency of controls and checks on operators, something that never existed before. All right. Now, of course, to answer or come back to core questions of this session. So what does this new EU deforestation regulation mean? Or what would it mean for global trade between producer and consumer countries? What would you mean also in terms of the effectiveness or effective implementation of that many different global transnational policy instruments and process that Georg already referred to? So in our work, we made few conclusions after assessing the design and the expected implementation of the EU deforestation regulation. First, by design, we expect that the euphorically ratcheted up standards and implementation mechanisms are likely to harden the corporate accountability and would hold companies really accountable, responsible for negative socioeconomic and environmental externalities. However, with its different specific provisions, the EUDR might trigger new legal uncertainties and new open questions in terms of the very policy effectiveness. For example, very much looking backwards and learning from the very protracted, very incoherent implementation of the EU timber regulation and some other instruments out there, we would expect that also the implementation of the EU deforestation will be protracted. It will be incoherent, mainly because, on the one part, the different EU member states do have different political priorities, different capacities, different interests, and we expect that the very implementation of the EUDR within the European Union area and countries will be quite challenging, incoherent, which would probably mean, again, quite some legal uncertainties and headaches for many of the policy practitioners and companies. We are speaking here of different worlds of compliance that usually the European countries actually belong to. We can speak more about that. We also expect that the increased compliance requests will put a heavy burden on market operators, especially so on the small and medium-sized companies. And we expect that the EUDR will favor rather the multinational, the big companies, that already have had installed quite sophisticated control systems, due diligence systems that are probably can really afford to fund and put the needed resources to implement that. But what about all the others, right? So the EUDR might turn into something like a market barrier, not really favoring, let's say, the level playing field out there on the market. And basically, taken together, the expected incoherent, protracted policy implementation and enforcement, and also the heavy burdens on operators, might probably lead to trade leakage overall, to less regulated markets. This would probably lead to the frustration part of the exploitation that Ben Kishore already referred to, also to rebound effects, and finally to displaced deforestation and forest degradation. And I hope I have 5 minutes that are still available for us. I wanted to show you some key positions or positions of some key involved parties that might give us an idea what to expect for the upcoming weeks, months, and probably years to come. So start with the positions of the EU member states. So one important big group of European countries, basically that are either, they are all very developed, rich, but probably short on forest resources, consume a lot of tropical products, have big footprint, if you want to. They are organized in something like the Amsterdam Group that committed on a voluntary basis to support deforestation-free supply chains and products, very much led and coordinated by the Netherlands, where we are at the moment, including the other Benelux countries, but also countries like France, Germany, Spain, Italy, and of course the United Kingdom and Norway are also part of that. And this coalition of, let's say, progressive European countries, very much dependent on tropical product imports, have championed more or less the EU deforestation regulation. Yeah? They won or shaped the agendas and made all this agreement possible. To the right, you can see some illustrating quotations from the French Minister for the Energy Transition, justifying the very action, the very adoption of the EUDR from biodiversity and climate protection perspective, something that Georg already pointed out as being one of the big global forest frontier. Other countries were rather skeptical, especially Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Finland, but also some Eastern European countries like Poland, my original home country, Bulgaria, and some other countries, they were not really very much interested. They were probably also afraid of the EU deforestation regulation, putting probably an unnecessary burden on their own domestic operations. However, in the final vote, also these skeptical countries abstained. So they couldn't really allow to speak in public that they were against something that's known to be a big, big problem, right? Very much mirroring also the experience with the adoption of the EU timber regulation. Now I'm turned to the position of environmental NGOs and civil society organizations. So I believe it's more or less logical to say that they all were, of course, in favor of the EU deforestation regulation. They expected even more and harder, more euphoric standards. However, they mobilized a lot, mobilized the public, organized many voices, many initiatives to back up the whole initiative. So we see here the EUDR involved actually the largest, over 1 million submissions, consultation ever in the European Union. Here, quotation from Friends of the Earth. So they believe that, with the EUDR, there will be a legislation coming in that will cut demand. So as classical as it is. Other NGOs were more specific or more nuanced in their position. Still, they very much supported the EUDR. Some of them highlighting social concerns, others concerns of the tropical partner countries, etc., etc. Very interesting is here to mention the positive, the proactive position of many big multinational foods retailer companies. So you see all the logos there on the screen. I don't need to explain to you who they are, but mainly the big foods companies have really substantially supported the EUDR with the main economic argument to level the playing field on the global market. Still, there have been quite some other companies that express rather skeptical or pretty much objections here, mainly domestic industries within Europe, in the forest and agricultural sector, more or less saying that the EUDR would probably put unnecessary burden on their economic operations. Here also some quotations from the forest sector, very much supporting already existing instruments, voluntary in nature, supply side, certification, FLEGT, voluntary partnership agreements, and many of these kinds. Now I'm turning to the very interesting position of the tropical countries. You can probably well imagine, probably already know, they were not really amused. They were rather negatively surprised and really upset. And here are some quotations from Republic of Congo and Colombia, more or less expressing quite negative views, still trying to somehow keep a political tone of understanding with the EU, well knowing that the EU is one of their major export markets. The Republic of Indonesia also considered organizing a suit process against the EU before the WTO or other organizations, believing that with the EUDR, EU is running something like a regulatory imperialism, violating other bilateral laws that were agreed 10 years, 15 years ago. For example, the bilateral agreement between the EU and Indonesia in terms of the FLEGT, voluntary partnership agreement. And here some, of course, very critical voices from Brazil, more or less saying that unilateral decisions, like on behalf of the EU, are not really appropriate and are not really welcome. And this inequality will probably lead to less sustainability. So this is probably the frustration part of the quotation. In terms of a more constructive policy design, we've been observing that Indonesia has took the lead and also been supported by Cameroon, Ghana, Guyana, Liberia, Republic of Congo in building a so-called broader market recognition coalition, trying to get a global approval, kind of a global green lane for their national legality sustainability systems. this work is still in progress, and I had the privilege to be part of that as consultant, so let's see how this will develop. And on behalf of Certified, this is my last slide, my second last slide. You can see diversity of interest here. Many of the certifiers saying that they are really important in all of this process, and they were recommending either replacing the tough standards in the EUDR with their own systems or complementing the tough EUDR standards with the industry self-regulation or non-state market-driven standards. Thank you so much for your attention, and really very much looking forward to a nice discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Metodi, I'm going to leave you with two thoughts before going to Connie. And the one is you've nicely presented to us not just a review of the latest EU's efforts to address deforestation, but a review of the history as well as the coalitions. In my mind, I said to myself, why do we keep on inventing new initiatives every 2 or 3 years? Were they not as well designed as the previous ones? And of course, you talked about coalitions. And when you come back, I'm going to ask you, can you consider coalitions as being impacted by potentially small changes in the EUDR that might lead to a different outcome than what we would expect currently? Can we anticipate future impacts rather than our current approach, which is to wait 3 or 4 years, research the impact, and go, oh, wasn't quite what we wanted, and a new one is created again? How can we actually help the EU puzzle through their impacts better? I'll ask you when you come back. Not now, when you come back. Yeah. And now we're going to turn to, thank you, Metodi, our third speaker, Connie McDermott, for her in-depth analysis of these efforts in Ghana. So welcome, Connie.
Great, thanks. Could I have a little bit of help with the switching the slides? Because I'm a Mac user and I just find, yeah, okay. So I just click forward? Okay.
Just press this one. Sorry. That's all mine. It's all my baggage. This is what I wanted to discuss with you.
Up there, one back. There we go. Okay. All right, excellent. So yeah, carrying on the theme of euphoria, it was striking me that EU at the beginning of that word is worthy of noting. It's euphoria, but that's not what I quite describe how these policies have landed in the countries arguably most affected by them. So I want to talk about, in just 15 minutes, try to sort of bring these sort of policy discussions a bit more down to the ground, to the context where they're to be implemented. And to do this, to draw on the case of Ghana and cocoa. I also, as a caveat, want to say that this is just happening. So we're not going to come up with results of how this has impacted Ghana. And in fact, what you see in Ghana naturally is a big, reaction and response right now. And we are, Eric Kume, for example, who has helped contribute to our work there, is just now seeing what's happening on the ground. And I'd like to credit him also for the photos, and also him and Mark Hirons and other people I've worked on over the years in Ghana in looking at the evolving international policies and how they land. So, why Ghana? And why is that interesting here as a case study of the EUDR? Well, there's a number of reasons why it's actually a critical case study. So, cocoa is one of the 7 forest risk commodities that's covered by the EUDR. And what this means is that cocoa, as with the other 6 commodities, now has a requirement that all cocoa being imported into the EU those importing must show due diligence to ensure that that cocoa was not contributing to deforestation in the country of origin. And also, furthermore, it requires that the source of the cocoa be geolocated down to the farm level. So we have to know where that cocoa is coming from, which farms in Ghana, and then we have to ensure that it's not associated with deforestation. Now, Ghana is the world's 2nd largest producer of cocoa, so it's certainly important from thinking about cocoa. And also, it is a major driver of deforestation, has been historically. So that also makes the EUDR relevant. But also, unlike a number of these other commodities, Ghana has a relatively, captive position here. So for example, in 2022, 44% of Ghana's exports were being sold to the EU. So the EUDR has potentially very, very big impacts. And then also, as Ben and others have touched on, Ghana is also interesting because there's a whole long history and trajectory of international policies hitting Ghana. So one in particular that is really the precursor to the EUDR is the EU Forest Law Enforcement Governance and Trade Plan, which was started in 2003. And really critically, Ghana was the first country signatory back in 2009 to a voluntary partnership agreement between the EU and Ghana that was meant to develop a system to ensure that the timber being exported to the EU was legal and followed the laws of the country. And likewise, as some of you may or may not be aware, along with the EU flagged VPAs came the EU timber regulation, which is literally sort of the precursor to the EUDR. And in that regulation, I'll explain a little bit more, is about ensuring that timber entering the EU is not violating the laws of the country of origin. So in Ghana, we've got all these reasons why it's a very interesting country in terms of understanding what might happen with the EUDR. Somehow, unfortunately, the punchline has been removed from this slide. So I will tell you what should be in those mystery blue boxes. So the first one is, okay, so Ghana is also really interesting as a case study of equity in the EUDR. Why? Well, the first box should say inequalities in global trade. So Ghana, it didn't work. I tried that. It just went to the next slide. Well, strange. Anyway, no, that's okay. So inequalities in global trade. So Ghana is dependent on cocoa production actually to service its international debt. So this is not a small matter for Ghana. It's now, and after COVID, after various economic, the war in Ukraine, et cetera, it's in dire straits and has a massive debt to pay. So now this is hitting a country that's already in a kind of disadvantaged position because actually it needs to service its national debt, and cocoa is leverage for that. The second point, which is absolutely key, which you will certainly get from listening to my talk, is that smallholders produce cocoa. So cocoa, unlike some of these other commodities that are addressed by the EUDR, is a smallholder crop, pretty much across the board. And it's interesting to note that the price of in terms of the farmer's capture of the price of a chocolate bar, back in the 1970s, it was something like 50%. It's now estimated that smallholders receive 3 to 7% of the price of a chocolate bar. This is pre-EUDR, everything else. It's not a very good deal. And smallholders, meanwhile, we're finding are facing climate change, rapid inflation for, affording the price of food or fuel is very difficult, expanding environmental requirements. So you also have this challenge that actually the group that may be arguably most directly affected is already in a pretty tough position. And then the final is around really the issue of complex tenure arrangements and tree tenure, land tenure, et cetera. Like in many parts of the tropics, a lot of farmers do not necessarily have formal rights to their land. If they do, in many cases, it's not direct private ownership of land. They have various very diverse and complex relationships with local traditional authorities, et cetera. And those are not, those are not without a time frame. So they may have rights to a cocoa farm for a certain period of time, and then they have to renegotiate them. There's also a lot of inequalities among farmers in terms of access to land, including high-quality cocoa land. And also another key thing that's really interesting in Ghana, and this is not as usual in other countries, farmers actually lack legal rights to the naturally growing trees on their cocoa farms. So they're actually held in Ghana, and I'm going to come to this in a minute. Basically, the rights over the timber on the cocoa farm is something held in fiduciary. The land is owned by the chiefs, but the government is the one that assigns rights to the timber on the farm, and the value of that timber, none of that is shared with the farmer. So likewise, it's actually useful. since we're moving from the mother of EUDR to EUTR, to talk a little bit about setting the stage by looking at what happened with the VPA in Ghana and the EU Flag T. So, as I mentioned, it was back about 14 years ago in 2009 that Ghana signed a VPA to develop a legality licensing system and Flag T licenses to ensure that the EU, when it imported wood from Ghana, that it was legal and verified legal. And the promise in return from the EU was that these licenses would provide a green lane demonstrating compliance with the EU timber regulation, which is a unilateral trade ban on the import of illegal wood into the EU. So they've been 14 years trying to work on developing a system. What's happened? Well, now, increasingly now, especially with the EUDR coming in, there's been a lot of contestations over the equity of the VPA itself. The core focus within Flag T, because the incentive is basically market-based, is getting timber into the EU, and it's focused on export. A lot of the emphasis and investment has been on getting a system of making timber concessions legality verified. However, to date, no Flag T licenses have been approved by the EU. So only Indonesia, actually, of the countries that entered in VPAs have actually produced Flag T licenses. And now, after all that effort, it's not going to count anyway because the EUDR actually cancels out or replaces the EUTR. So not necessarily in a green lane because the the Flag T license system was not designed to determine that there's no deforestation. It was designed to determine that the wood harvesting was legal. So at the local level, what other thing important to understand is that cocoa farms are very much embroiled in this because actually a lot of the timber produced, especially for domestic and local use in Ghana, comes from cocoa farms. Remember those trees that in many cases the farmers don't actually own. If they're naturally growing on the farm, they don't own them, but those are important sources of informal wood for the domestic and local market, and also even formal wood through these concessions. So, gosh, this really, okay. Yeah, so I'll walk you through this. Anyway, we don't have to have slides. I'd be overly dependent on PowerPoint. So apologies. Again, Mac, not, this user. So anyway, from the Flag T to VPA, so we're starting from that place now in Ghana where we're going, okay, now suddenly the emphasis is going to be on the EUDR and on the Flag T VPA. What is some of the differences? Well, one of the big differences is that unlike the VPA, EUDR is a unilateral process. So it means that the EU is writing rules to affect extraterritorial actors. And I would argue that it's reductive. So its primary focus is on deforestation. So when you look at the sort of monitoring frameworks being developed over the EUDR, its biggest emphasis on satellite monitoring of forest cover. So, which is, although it does include requirements around legality, the big focus is on deforestation. That's where the political will is coming from. This creates, and what I want to argue here is it creates both normative and instrumental challenges. So let's start with the normative. I think those are of varying levels of concern. But the idea that laws are written by those removed from and unaccountable to those affected and vulnerable, that is a challenge fundamental to the EUDR. You can try to fix it or adjust it or do whatever else you like with it, but that is a fundamental normative challenge and might explain some of the political backlash. It prioritizes the EU's concerns about deforestation over the local communities and producers and national governments. It does risk that the poorest and most vulnerable populations face the greatest risks and disproportionate costs from the regulation. It's also kind of a problematic legal precedent. So the reason that the EU can do this and maybe have an impact is that it's a big global trader. How did it get that way? Well, we can go into some of the history of how the EU came to play a very dominant position in global trade. Not all of it ideal. Okay, sure, yeah. Okay, no, that's okay. So those are normative challenges, but those aren't the only challenges with the unilateral policy. There are also instrumental challenges. What do I mean by that? Well, it's this idea of policies being sort of removed from their context. So the EUDR was agreed within the EU FORC, and then it was time to visit the countries and say, okay, how are we going to operationalize this? So what I want to do when I go through a bit more on the sort of realities of deforestation and of cocoa production in Ghana, say what kinds of policy mismatches does that create? Yeah, so like this one, that's where I'm at now. Yeah, that would be really helpful. No, this is really strange. Okay. Oh, that's much better. Okay, thanks. So yeah, so the decontextualization. There's also, as I'll touch on, this issue around scale. So it's very commodity focused. That's why I'm saying reductivist in that sense. It's focused on particular commodities, not deforestation across the whole landscape. It also, like hearkening back to the FLEGT VPA, there's a strong emphasis on international trade. And that's where I think it'd be interesting to talk, Metodi, about, is this really so strongly state-based, or how much is it also market-based? Because the incentives in it are aligned with importing particular commodities into the EU. So in that sense, trade is it's a very strong international trade basis. And then this problem of institutional fit, EU has rules and regulations, and those are going to meet these informal, messy from EU's perspective. They have a lot of sense on the ground, but they're not so legible. And then the issue of legitimacy, so huge risk of resistance, sabotage, polarization, backlash, and all of this, as we know, in global politics is alive and well now. So what I want to try to argue for is, what do we do under this circumstance? We have this new rule. What's really key is to try to learn from it. So see, how would we, if we wanted to measure how is it going to actually play out? And I want to make an argument that whether you're concerned about normative issues or instrumental issues, that thinking about it from an equity perspective can be really useful. Why? Not because we're going to say what's equitable, because we're not going to all agree on that, and that's, I think, healthy, but because it helps us think through all the trade-offs and how those might impact the results. So I want to draw on the Melanie McDermott et al. Framework in a broad sense, just because I like the way it highlights sort of the two issues of framing. So equity plays in when we talk about the framing of the law and how it's written, and not just its outcomes. So a lot of the talk about monitoring impacts is focused at the outcome level, but we also have to think about the equity dynamics at these framing levels. So at the outcome level, you may be aware, in justice and equity, we often distinguish, long history of literature, between distributive, procedural, and recognitional or contextual equity. These are things we can think about when we're trying to look at the outcomes of the EUDR. But even already, equity outcomes are happening. So one is, who writes the rules? For what? How do we decide that deforestation is sort of the central issue? And then who matters? EU citizens, Ghanaian farmers, et cetera. So who writes the rules? I think as Metodi highlighted, there's a lot of enthusiasm among, for example, the European Commission over this rule, this regulation. It's clear why it's extremely popular. So on their website, they said it was the second most popular in the history of the EU. Overwhelming support from European citizens for this. However, who doesn't write the rules certainly were the countries that are going to be very directly impacted, trade-dependent producing countries. For what? Now, as I said, it's focused on deforestation. This is a graph of trends in deforestation in Ghana over the last 20 years or so. So Ghana is a pretty high-risk country from that perspective. And it's kind of interesting to note that 2009 was when they entered into the VPA. So remember, and this was meant to be good, improved forest governance, et cetera. Boom, deforestation takes off. So what's so interesting, too, is kind of the whole issue around the politics of success and how was it that, that there's so much success with illegal logging, let's move on to, a policy built off of it, when in fact, people can debate about the level of success. Another issue. EUDR does not address tree cover loss and other deforestation drivers. So this here shows a graph, also put the 2009 VPA as a reference. The yellow is other, that's not cocoa. The yellow, a lot of that is at food crop production and other kinds of things that are happening. And then red is deforestation, commodity-driven deforestation. So which includes cocoa. So actually, the other challenge, this isn't addressed, this is not going to be addressed by the EUDR. There's not really scope within that. We can get into all the details as to why it doesn't. But in fact, actually, it creates more incentive for the government to focus on cocoa, not these other things. So who are the subjects of equity? Who counts in the EUDR? Well, there's the issue of the global north versus the global south. We already got into that a bit. Who pays the price? Who benefits? Now, another thing I think that's so interesting is the issue of indigenous peoples and local communities. So within the EU, that's been a big discussion. But a lot of the time, it sticks on the victims of deforestation. So if you see local communities, indigenous people, primarily as victims of deforestation, then adding more and more requirements about human rights, about child labor, et cetera, sure, go for it. But if you see them as the producers, then, and they're smallholders, that means that many more requirements on the 3% of the profits of the chocolate bar that smallholders are facing dealing with. In terms of ecosystems, it's going to essentially most surely mean a focus on the forest reserves, but not all these other ecosystems. The whole issue around, what's a forest, and cocoa forest landscapes are not going to be included unless they're, because by the definitions anyway. So it prioritizes particular ecosystems and definitions. So then, now so those are the framing issues around equity. Now let's think about how we can start to monitor the impacts across those dimensions of distributive, procedural, and recognitional equity. Well, I think what's so important when we think about measuring outcomes is how, first of all, who gets to decide what we're going to monitor, what's important, and also that we look at the broader impacts, not just the sort of direct impacts, because right now, you have in the EUDR, we want to know that this particular piece of cocoa, or chocolate that I'm eating didn't come from deforestation. But we, but actually, and then we want to know that that particular piece of cocoa wasn't planted on something that was deforested after 2020, what have you. That doesn't tell you about what else the farmer is doing or anything else that's going on in the landscape. So there's lots of indirect impacts, potentially. There's lots of underlying systemic, stochastic, unanticipated impacts in terms of impacts on trade and economy, legal frameworks, governance systems, et cetera, that may have more impact on deforestation than the issue of whether your chocolate bar had deforestation in it. So I do think there's also a real risk, because this is something that the EU is going to have to monitor and measure and quantify, that you're going to focus on those things that are easier to measure, but maybe some of the biggest effects are going to be broader and more diffuse, but there are ways to look at them. But anyway, attribution becomes increasingly difficult. And also, how are we going to deal with variation? Because surely countries are going to vary in terms of how this plays out. It's going to vary by communities, it's going to vary by commodity. And especially if you have a sort of unilateral policy where the policy making happens within the EU, divorced from all of that, what are we going to see in terms of dealing with this variation? So very quickly, these are just examples, by the way, because the EUDR sets a really high level of challenge in terms of trying to think about how can we measure the impacts. But I put in some hypotheses here, because we don't know yet. But based on past research, et cetera, what are the kinds of things that we might expect to happen, or that we've heard people say might happen, or whatever else that we can start to monitor? So global trade. Some people say, oh, it'll be good, it'll raise the price of cocoa and farmers will benefit from that, but it'll also probably raise production costs. So we've got to watch that. We also look at trade patterns. So I think it's being told, Ghana, make sure that you're a low-risk country because that'll help you, but actually that's going to be a lot of convincing right now that Ghana is a low-risk country. So there's a risk that just going to shift trade of cocoa to some other country. And that's going to have some serious socioeconomic impacts, especially because they've got their debt service and everything else. Then we have local social ecological impacts. And we might expect, as is often the case with trade-based policies, that some farmers are able to negotiate good benefits. They tend to be, maybe the wealthier or more better organized cooperatives. And as you already see, the poorer marginal farmers have difficulty accessing high-quality cocoa land. Those that live near a reserve, forget it, because a lot of companies may just decide, you know what, it's really about forest reserves, so all the cocoa production around here, it's too much trouble. We're just not working in that area, gone. So we also might expect to see that deforestation is increasingly driven by non-cocoa land use. As you sort of clamp down on cocoa, there's going to be this, well, whatever else are they going to do? They're going to find other opportunities. And maybe not much effect on tree cover loss then. Remember, tree cover loss is not the same as deforestation. Deforestation is a shift to another land use, but tree cover loss, may, is decisions around trees on cocoa farms, et cetera, and reduction of tree cover. So systemic effects, I think this is a really key one. and we see this a lot in our field work, that there's so much emphasis now on cocoa, and this sort of favors the exports over local food production. Oh, I've got to. So this is going to put a lot of government emphasis on how can we deal with this issue of cocoa and not the other land uses. And as has been brought up before, as a kind of trade-based policy, it's not just trade-based, but increasing inequality and distribution of costs and benefits. Okay, I'll zoom through. So in terms of procedural equity, again, I mentioned the issue around unilateralism raises issues around procedural inequality. And I think this sort of global trends towards, this feeding into this demand for more and more traceability and sort of external ratcheting up of requirements, is going to affect, well, it's basically going to mean that external actors are writing the rules and that these often mismatch with national, local efforts and innovations. And then what we see all the time in terms of participatory governance, so let's say, okay, as an EU or external actor, I want to promote local participatory governments. There's going to be a strong incentive, because that's what you mostly see, that's going to be very focused around how to serve EU priorities. How are we going to ensure forest protection, tree planting, and good cocoa production? It's not going to be food crops. It's not going to be how are we going to help farmers, actually have a more sustainable food production. So contextual equity, politics, and now politics of knowledge and data, very interesting question. This whole issue around geolocation, we're already seeing on the ground how different groups are vying for control over data on farms, and that who owns that and who has access to that is incredibly difficult and problematic, and certainly not transparent, and it's very unclear. So farmers in some cases may be given ownership over the data, but they don't really own it if they must give it to the EU in order to sell their cocoa. What does happen, however, is many other actors may be excluded from accessing that data. And this sort of general focus on this sort of formalized data and reporting for external actors. So basically, conclusions, unilateral reductive policies create major challenges for equity. This does matter normatively and instrumentally to the goals of the EUDR and the international community. Global trade-based policies do risk reinforcing existing inequalities. So it's so important that we apply a critical equity lens to help monitor and mediate the EUDR impacts. Thanks.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Connie. And while I'm asking a quick question of you, maybe Georg and Methodi can come back. You can all come to the stage now. We've got time for a few minutes of questions. And happily, after this panel is lunchtime, and you can have more conversations with our panelists over lunch. What struck me about Connie's talk was that it was so wide-ranging about understanding the impacts that might occur and are occurring on this latest initiative, the assessment of which could have been also placed on the last 15 instruments before that time. And so my question for Connie was going to be around, given all the hypotheses, which I loved, by the way, thank you, what would that then mean for intervening now to change the effects in some way? How could we take those lessons and go forward? But I'm going to actually not have you guys answer right now, and instead open it up for some questions that then you can hear and then respond after I get a few questions in the mix. So question over here, and please put your hands up so I can recognize you. And then right behind you afterwards. Yep.
Thanks very much. I'm Lorraine Elliott from the Australian National University. I'd like to draw a line between Connie's presentation and Georg's, and it's about the frontiers, because I'm actually wondering whether legality and illegality should be a separate frontier rather than one that seems to be collapsed under a number of other things. That whole tension between legality and sustainability, we can trace that back to FLEGT and the European trade regulations. And I'm not convinced myself, the work I do on timber trafficking and illegal logging and associated trade, I don't think that the EUDR does anything better than EUTR did to understand the complexity of production networks and supply chains around the trade associated with illegality, because it's not just about round wood, it's about production, it's about the way in which timber goes across borders and is then recertified. And so I'd just really like to get a sense from you about where you see that issue of legality, because at the moment it seems to be the assumption is if it's not associated with deforestation, then it will meet all the legality requirements. And I don't think that that's a reasonable assumption. So I'd just like to get you to follow up perhaps a bit on that.
Thank you. And right behind you?
Thank you very much. You just mentioned in the last presentation that there's a need for like policy issues that go beyond unilateralism from the consuming country, but require like 10-year regulation or maybe even a role in monitoring. What was it else? Anyway, I was wondering, on what level do you think can there be like a harmonization or like a negotiation between parties? Like, could Ghana, for example, negotiate like a certain agreement on complementary policies, or would that induce spillover effects to other countries? Or you know, on what level do you think do we need an agreement in that sort sense to assure equity?
Okay, great. Any other question right now for this round? Oh yeah, okay, one over here.
Yeah, I am Eduardo Viola from the University of São Paulo. I would like to ask you, you didn't in any presentation talk about the conflictive social forces in, for example, forest countries. I mean, I have studied a lot the Amazon and Brazil in particular. And there are conflicts. So when you say the interest of Ghana, maybe it's the interest of the dominant players in Ghana that question and challenge the European Union directive. But there are other interests that are considered this as favorable for advancing the decarbonization of the economy. This happens in Brazil, clearly, but I am asking if this is something that happens in other forest countries also.
Great, thank you. Let's go Matodi, Connie, and Georg. In that order? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben. I probably will give short answer to the legality, sustainability question, or legality, illegality question. Well, under the EUDR, the main innovation is that basically we know that, of course, in some tropical countries, deforestation can be legal, right? But under the EUDR, this is not possible any longer. It could be legal, but basically you may not put products that are associated with deforestation on the EU market. So basically, if you are only in full compliance with the EUDR, if your products are not only legal but also sustainable, and in that sense, actually, EUDR goes beyond the EUDR legality standard. So in that sense, I guess EUDR can help fight illegal activities. But for sure, EUDR is just one of many instruments. I would say the emphasis should be on good forest compliance and enforcement in the tropical countries. Thank you.
We could do it like question by question. That might be easier because trying to remember. So I could respond on the legality first, and then
Sure.
Because So there's so many. I'll try to come in a short response because we don't have time. But so I think what you might have been saying, which I would fit our experience with this, is that I think the EUDR is focused on deforestation. It does have a clause that the production must be legal. But that's not where most of the emphasis is. And as we know, unlike with the VPA, we spent years trying to negotiate what is legal, how are you going to measure it, except that's not happening. So I don't, you're just not going to see the same level of attention to that issue. And it is a different issue. It's problematic in its own right, but it is a different issue. So I think there is a tendency on the EUDR, let's dump more and more things onto it, but what is really going to stick? Because what we see is, where are the sort of political winds and where is the most of the scrutiny going? So it is, I would agree it's a different issue. But do we just respond to that one and then we can go to the next question?
Sure.
As you wish. As you wish. Okay, as you wish. Okay, thank you. Then I will respond to all three, but I try to make it short. Legality, I think it's, for me, part of the rights and justice frontier. This question of who has the right to use the forest. I would like to also emphasize what you said, Methodi. For me, it's a major shift between the legality politics we had 10 years ago, 12 years ago, where very clearly there was already the environmental groups were fighting to have sustainability being part of these policies, but in the end, the minimal compromise was to say, let's focus on legality, because who can be against forbidding something that's illegal? That's very difficult to lobby against, right? Now we have this massive shift. So we have, in the EU context, we have a policy content. We say, well, we want legality, but we also want to really stop deforestation, which of course is much more entering into other countries in a way, but it's also much more substantial. For me, the really interesting question is, why do we have this shift now? Why not 10 years ago, when sort of the argument was this will never go through WTO? There was much more interest in free trade, I would say, 12 years ago. Second, unilateralism, bilateralism, an interesting comment, I thought. I wonder how this will play out now, because there is now a strong policy set there. That was a bit similar also with the legality policies, because it was the US Lacey Act, it was the EUTR, it was the Australian law that was also in these countries set up. But still, they were basically trying to reinforce legality where no country can object it. Now we have something else. I really wonder, it's for empirical research to see if there is a way for bilateral or more fair, or how this will play out. Also, we have a different economy today. The powerhouses are not so more anymore in Europe as they have been 15 years ago. Last comment, Sao Paulo, super interesting. What I try to do in my presentation, I think these frontiers, which is a super simplification, as we will all agree, I think they are crossing through the forest countries. And you have lots of, I heard you talking about decarbonization debates, bioeconomy, big thing in Brazil as well. You have that debate in all, I would say, natural resource or nature-rich countries, and also the conflict within the countries. And I think a lot in your talk, Connie, was about that. Who is suffering, who's benefiting now from new policies? So I answered all three questions. I'm done. I can go to lunch, right?
Okay. No, you cannot.
Do you want to do?
I don't think I can really contribute to any answer. Sorry, I don't feel comfortable. Knowledgeable enough to answer your questions in particular. But I agree. Yes, in Brazil, sure, there are many other local or regional conflicts, and definitely EUDR supports some of the parties there, but actually it goes astray other interests. For sure, we've seen also kind of a transatlantic, transnational mobilization of environmental groups, social groups that actually very much applauded and cheered the very adoption of the EUDR, whereas, and of course, some ministries on the environmental side were some, at least at the lower level administration, were very much supporting the EUDR or EUDR-like. Also, local regional businesses were also kind of, saying about stop the harmful subsidies and the harmful political decisions to deforest. We need to keep our EU markets clean, etc. So definitely agree with you.
Great, thanks. I mean, I think this is it. We were talking about 7 different commodities that are very different in terms of their politics, etc. So I wouldn't frame it in Ghana as, oh, the big powerful actors are against the EUDR and the poor farmers are for it. No, but it might look a little bit different with something like, well, particularly soy, for example, that's more dominated by large producers. So likewise, the NGO dynamics are different. Sure, there always are actors that can find a particular political situation and find a way to benefit from it to argue their case. That's a valid point. But I wouldn't say in the Ghana case anyway that this is a matter of the dominant actors are opposing the policy and the NGOs are happy with the situation. I think and likewise to answer the second question up there with the gentleman, I mean, it's kind of a difficult footing for negotiation when you've already imposed a policy on a country to then go, oh, now we're willing to talk, which is what's happening because they have to, because in order to implement this policy, you have to have support from the government. But it's starting on a back foot. And also, the EU is under massive tension in terms of, demonstrating it's taking a hard line and doing the same thing everywhere, with trying to, come up with and address context and say, well, maybe we need to, what might be seen as loosen the policy here or there. There's huge political tensions around the way this has been designed and set up.
Yeah. I want to exercise the chair's prerogative and just raise 2 questions for you to conclude this panel. One is Georg's point about this massive shift you're saying is occurring in the EU from legality to no deforestation. When I hear about this, and of course we've we've been engaging in these questions for a long time now, and I myself, for many years, in the 80s, no deforestation was the problem definition. Tropical deforestation was one of the major problem definitions. So when I hear you say it's a massive shift, I go, really? Or is it actually just back to the future, right? Yeah, right? So, and if so, then the second question, which is a very provocative question, okay? I'm warning you all. What if, thinking of Connie's slide on deforestation, what if all these efforts of the last 30 years, the designs, redesigns, RED+, legality, CNI, FSC, and so on, what if actually they are all really effective? So what if they're really effective, not ineffective? What if the results that they're getting, that we're seeing on the ground, massive growth, massive deforestation, massive development, are actually is the actual objective, to use, Luke's latent power, right? That this is actually a very effective regime taking place. And we're all saying, not effective, let's design better. But actually, they're really effective. Just provocative question. I'm not saying it's me making the point, I'm just raising the question. But what are your thoughts on both those? And you only got like, 30 seconds each to respond to.
Okay. Yeah, I would say they are massively effective in terms of gaining, increasing political support. So, why is the EUDR passed through? It's gotten massive political support. And that tends to risk getting quite disconnected from what it claims that it's trying to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Short question on your very first, short answer to your first question, Ben. Why we are observing now these big shifts in policy? Well, I would say about 10 years, 15 years ago, it was politically not feasible to regulate agricultural supply chains.
Okay.
There was knowledge about the big impact of forest, rich agricultural commodities, but at least in Brussels, there was no political momentum for
political feasibility.
Feasibility, exactly.
Okay.
The second, I believe, why we are seeing here rather this policy change, I would say rather strategic learning, that the previous instruments have not delivered on their promises. Like the VPAs taking too long, too costly, just Indonesia, but all other countries, right, dragging and not really making progress. And NGOs, EU institutions, running out of patience.
So learning's happening now. Learning's happening for some reason now.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, interesting point. We got to come back to you in another panel. Okay.
Okay, how many seconds are left?
Okay.
Well, first, I think there is a massive shift in the focus of that policy instrument because we go beyond legality, but the problem definition has remained the same even before the 80s, I would say. That tries that. And that's the interesting question then, connecting to your second question, you could say you have this massive policy shift to really tackle the content directly, not to go around the corner with legality or not.
Yeah.
And you could say it's because of a frustration about the success of the previous instruments, but I would also argue, and that was very nice in your presentation, of course there's also economic arguments behind. We live in a different world than where we lived in 15 years ago, and there is a certain degrees of liberalism and trust in free trade. I think this is your panel description, right? Was it protectionism and green?
Yeah.
And it goes somehow together, which is on one hand the strengths. That's why we have this policy that really can have an impact. That's also why it's massively contested, and that's why we need to further research on it. Is that a nice closing statement?
I would conclude by saying, first of all, the point of this panel is not just to reflect on the past and our research, but also to deliberate over how we as a community might be able to think about a different future. Right? And this community here at this conference is part of that process. We're not just looking at the data, we're thinking about how do we actually become citizens in ways that are responsible and effective. And you three have done a wonderful job in that journey. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful, engaging conversation. Thank you. And to Montri for organizing. Ooh.
20 seconds. So I just wanted to kind of wrap up saying that this discussion is just the beginning. We have a follow-up dialogue tomorrow on the same topic, and with these speakers, along with the key speakers, will be joining us from the NGO sectors, WWF in Netherlands, Friends of the Earth, then Finnish Environment Institute, European Forest Institute. So we will have more speakers, same time tomorrow at Grotius Building, same topic. And we will also have a follow-up discussion in Singapore a week later.
You're all invited.
So anyone interested can reach us out to kind of be a part of this growing discussion and network. Finally, we have our institute brochures. there in front
And
of...
the job descriptions too. Yeah.
The job descriptions as well as institute brochures right there at the corner before you leave the room. If you are interested, you can just pick up one. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Maitri. Thank you. Thank you.
Just very quickly for practicalities, if you don't want to get lost for finding lunch, because I think we're all hungry, you go out the door, you turn left, you walk all the way to the end of the corridor, and on your right-hand side you see a bridge, a glass bridge. You can walk through it, down the stairs, and you're there. That's where the lunch is. It's very easy. Left, straight, right, down.
Deforestation-free.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.